Whether you play casual or competitive Magic, you must have noticed that it's a very complex and vast game, so it's easy to get lost between the huge amount of rules and interactions between the cards. That's why it's very important to know how the cards behave in different situations. More so, if you're playing tabletop tournaments, where the interactions aren't taken care of by an official software like both Magic Arena and Magic Online. These videos are gonna focus on some common modern decks and the rulings applied to the cards used in most lists. So, let's shed a light upon some of the creatures used in one of my favorite archetypes, the modern Grixis Death Shadow decks. The Death Shadow, namesake of the deck archetype, is one of the most bizarre creatures used in the whole modern format. It's a 13/13 that costs only 1 black mana and has an ability that reads: Death Shadow gets -X/-X, where X is your life total. That means it will get stronger the closer you are to 0 life. Now, let's take a look at some of the relevant rulings on Death Shadow. These first two are pretty straightforward. Number 1 informs the player that the creature's ability only takes effect while it's on the battlefield. Therefore, it must be treated as a 13/13 on any other zone. This is important because some cards care about the stats of a creature in many different zones, like in graveyard or hand. One example is Netherite, Apex of Death. But note that, when casting something like Fling and sacrificing a Death Shadow to it, the spell will take into account the last known power of the shadow while on the battlefield, and not its total 13 power. Number 2 simply states that if you somehow manage to go below 0 life, with the assistance of a card like Phyrexian Unlife, the Shadow's ability will still consider X to be 0, meaning it can only go so far as to become a 13/13 via this method. Moving on, the last two rulings are the ones that make the magic of the Death Shadow happen. The first one reads: if your life total is 13 or greater, and nothing else is boosting the toughness of Death Shadow, it is put into its own or graveyard as a state-based action. The important thing to remember is the state-based action portion. That's what allows this creature to survive some crazy scenarios with the assistance of its last ruling, which says that the value of X changes as you gain and lose life. It is not locked in as Death Shadow enters the battlefield. In simple terms, as long as you've lost life and you're still alive, Death Shadow has the potential to get bigger. To illustrate, let's take a look at some things that might happen when both the Shadow and its controller take damage at the same time. Imagine you're at 8 life, with 1 Death Shadow on the battlefield, and your opponent declares an attack with 2 fearsome Reality Smashers. Some might say you'd have to block and trade your precious creature in order to avoid taking lethal damage, but Death Shadow ability allows it to block a stronger or equally powerful creature without actually dying in these situations. Because of the way damage and state-based actions work, in this scenario, your Death Shadow would not die, because after damage is dealt, you would still be at 3 life, and then the game will check whether any of the conditions for state-based actions have been met. One of these conditions is, if a creature has toughness greater than 0, and it has damage marked on it, and the total damage marked on it is greater than or equal to its toughness, that creature has been dealt lethal damage and is destroyed. But in this case, your Death Shadow is now at 10/10 with only 5 damage marked on it. Therefore, the blocked Reality Smasher will have been killed by the Death Shadow in combat, and it will still be alive and on the battlefield, ready to team or battle rage your opponent to death on the next turn. The same principle is applied when an opponent lets some damage go through when attacking with a creature that has trample. That being said, if your opponent controlled only 1 Reality Smasher, and you block with a, say, 3/3 Death Shadow, there's a chance it will survive, provided your opponent doesn't know about this ruling and lets 2 damage go through. That's not very likely to happen in higher levels of play, so be careful. You should also note that the first strike damage is dealt in a different phase than normal combat damage. So if you block a first striker that has enough damage to kill your shadow, and all the other unblocked creatures don't have either first or double strike, the Death Shadow will not have the chance to grow at the same time as it took damage, and will die the next time state-based actions are checked, in this case, normal combat damage step. Another interesting feature that uses the same principle as the ones I just showed up is that spells like Searing Blaze and Bonfire of the Damned can't really kill a Death Shadow under normal circumstances. That's because a spell has to resolve in its entirety in order for the state-based actions to be checked, and when that happens, your Death Shadow will have taken the same amount of damage as you, therefore being practically unharmed. Recently, the Death Shadow decks have gained an incredible new tool, the Shadow's bigger and scarier brother, the Scourge of the Skycleaves. Now, they might seem pretty similar at first glance, but because of the way this card is built, it functions a bit differently than its older counterpart. One of the first differences between the two creatures is that the Scourge doesn't have a set power and toughness printed on it. Rather, it uses asterisks to represent both stats. This is known as a characteristic defining ability, and it works on all zones, not just the battlefield. Because the Scourge cares about the life total of both players, it is important to note that it might become stronger by dealing damage on the first strike phase due to the effects of cards like Temur Battle Rage. A simple example of this is that if you are at 10 life and your opponent is at 15, and you attack with a double strike Scourge, it will first deal 5 damage to your opponent in the first strike phase, and then, on normal combat damage phase, because your opponent lost 5 life, it will now be a 10-10 creature, therefore being able to deal lethal damage to the opposing player. That's why it's even more dangerous than the Shadow in some scenarios. It can become bigger by simply dealing damage to your opponent. And if you somehow manage to cast a kicked Scourge, remember, the kicker trigger will go on the stack on top of the kicked spell, meaning that each player will lose life equal to half their life total rounded up before the Scourge enters the battlefield. It's also worthy to note that kicking a spell doesn't change its converted mana cost, so a kicked Scourge could still be countered by something like Spell Snare, but not by a card like Disdainful Stroke. Now let's take a look at everyone's favorite zombie fish. The Gurmag Angler is one of the big stars of the Grixis version of the Death Shadow deck. It is a 5/5 that is able to be cast for as low as 1 black mana, putting your opponents on the clock very quickly. The thing that makes the Gurmag so special is its Delve ability and the way it interacts with its casting and converted mana cost. Delve reads, each card you exile from your graveyard while casting this spell pays for 1 generic mana. First and foremost, it's very clear that Delve may only help you pay generic mana costs. The colored part of the spell will remain the same, meaning that, on normal circumstances, you will have to pay a minimum of 1 black mana to cast the Angler. Now, because you exile the cards as part of casting of the spell, no opponent may exile the cards you delved from your graveyard in order to prevent its casting. They may respond however they want, but not before the Angler is already on the stack, and the cards used to delve it are already in exile. That's why, as long as you're able to cast a creature spell, by having priority, nothing on the stack, and being of one of the turn's main phases, no player may respond by exiling cards in order to prevent you from putting the fearsome zombie fish on the battlefield. Another noteworthy characteristic is that Delve doesn't change the converted mana cost of this creature. Therefore, it cannot be countered by something like a Chalice of the Void with 1 void counter on it if you've only played 1 black mana and exiled 6 cards to cast it. Gurmag's converted mana cost will remain 7, no matter how many cards you exiled in order to cast it. Talking about how many cards you can exile while casting the Angler, it is also important to notice that you can't exile more cards than the generic mana requirement of a spell with Delve. So, you have to be careful when dealing with opponents using effects that care about the cards in your graveyard, because you can't simply use the Gurmag to wipe your whole graveyard clean. Lastly, because Delve isn't an alternative cost, it can be used in conjunction with alternative costs. So, if you somehow manage to give this creature a casting cost like that of Convoke or Dash, you might still use its Delve ability to reduce the casting cost even further. Moving on, Tasigur the Golden Fang is functionally very similar to the Angler, the only noteworthy difference being its activated ability. For 2 generic and 2 hybrid blue and green mana, you can put the top 2 cards of your library in your graveyard, and then an opponent chooses a non-land card from your graveyard, and you return this chosen card to your hand. The important ruling about Tasigur states that an opponent may choose any non-land card, not just the ones that have been put there due to the Tasigur's activated ability. And it is also worthy to notice that the ability doesn't target any card or player, meaning that it can't be used to full effect even if the chosen opponent is protected by hexproof effects, such as the ones from Ley Line of Sanctity. Now the Street Wraith is a rather simple but extremely useful card. It can reduce your life total quickly while getting you a substitute card. It can fill your graveyard if you're playing with Gurmag Anglers, and can be used as a combat trick or a buff spell for creatures like the Death Shadow and the Scourge. It's important to note that the cycling ability can be used at instant speed, so you might want to keep some of those in your hand until a crucial moment, where you can either deal lethal damage to your opponent by making your creatures that care about your life total bigger, or you can save them from damage or kill spells that care about power or toughness without actually spending mana. Because cycling is an activated ability, it will be affected by anything that interacts with those kinds of abilities, such as cards like Pithing Needle and Stifle. Note that the discarding and paying life part of the ability is the cost of its activation, and as such, cards that counter the ability while on the stack will only prevent you from drawing a card and not from losing life and discarding the Wraith. One of the most powerful 2-drops in all of Magic's history, Snapcaster Mage is almost always present in Grixis' build of Death Shadow decks. This card has a triggered ability that happens whenever it enters the battlefield, or ETBs for short, meaning it doesn't have to actually be cast in order to give flashback to any instant or sorcery card in your graveyard. So, if you manage to get your Snapcaster Mage on the battlefield via any other effect, for example, Unearth or Aether Vial, it will still trigger its ETB. However, it means that if the Snapcaster is countered, or by any other means doesn't get to hit the battlefield, it won't be able to give flashback to your used spells. Snappy's ability says that the chosen instant or sorcery spell gains flashback until the end of the turn, and that the flashback cost is equal to the spell's mana cost. That being said, if you target something like Dismember or Surgical Extraction, you can still pay the Phyrexian mana with life, because that characteristic is part of the spell's mana cost. This is equally true if you're trying to cast a spell that has X on its casting cost, meaning you can choose and value to X other than 0, as long as you can pay for it. Now, since flashback is an alternative cost, it cannot be used in addition with other alternative casting costs, such as the ones on Force of Negation or the Overload on Cyclonic Rift, meaning you can only cast these cards via Snapcaster Mage by paying the mana cost printed on the top right corner of the card. And also, if you give flashback to a card that already has flashback, you may choose between any of those two costs when casting the spell. As for split cards, the flashback cost is always going to be the one of the half you want to cast, so if you target back and call with Snappy's ability, you'll have to play a blue and a green to cast back, or 4 generic mana and a white and a blue mana for call. Note that you can't cast these cards with Fuse because you aren't casting them from your hand. And finally, you can pay additional costs along with flashback, such as Kicker, and you must pay any mandatory additional costs, such as the one on Tormenting Voice or Fling. Some lists have been using this little creature as a reinforcement on the Grixis Death Shadow deck, as it's able to hit very hard very quickly, especially with the help of cards like Dimir Battle Rage. The Sprite Dragon has an ability that reads almost like a prowess trigger, with the difference that it puts +1/+1 counters on it, instead of just giving +1/+1 until the end of the turn. The cool thing about these kinds of abilities is that they resolve before the non-creature spell that caused them to trigger. That way, you can use it to your advantage by using spells to save it from lethal damage, or kill spells that care about the creature's power, or enable something like a ferocious Stubborn Denial, countering your opponent's non-creature spells outright. Thank you for watching. I hope this video has been useful to you, especially if you're someone who, like me, has already struggled in tournaments because you didn't know a particular interaction or rule. If you liked the video, share your thoughts about some MTG oddities you'd like to see on the next one. And especially, good luck and have fun, fellow Magic player.